Hello and welcome. In today's episode, I'm going to share encounters with black-eyed children. These stories include a man who had an encounter with one of these beings when he was a child back in the late 1960s, a man who had some bizarre occurrences in his home leading up to a knock on the door at 4 a.m., and a young woman who had two encounters with these entities, one of which was ongoing at the time of her posting. But first, we start with a story from a man whose wife and daughter were stalked by one of these beings. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from a poster whose ex-wife and young daughter had a terrifying experience in a mall when they were followed by a man described as having black eyes. I know this episode is focused on black-eyed children, but every now and then I come across a story with adults who have black eyes, and this is one that is definitely worth sharing. There's a bit of a twist at the end of this story that lends credence to my theory that these beings are supernatural in nature, as well as evil. The original poster, or OP, managed a store in the mall during the incident. He says this was long before the days of cell phones, and the store he worked in was dedicated to computer gaming. His store was located in an area where it faced the center of the mall. The store where his wife and daughter had their encounter was a major department store usually found in malls to his store's left at the end. He says the layout of that part of the mall is important to the story. His wife at the time the events of this story take place was just 20 years old and their daughter was 1.5. He says their children were so beautiful that they nearly looked like dolls. Being that this was the case, they attracted all kinds of attention in public with people approaching them. The interactions were uncomfortable for the parents and their children, but they were never anything like what happened to his daughter and ex-wife in the mall that day. It was a Sunday and the OP had planned to work the entire day since it was a shorter work day for him. He, his wife, and his daughter headed to the mall together. His wife took the time to dress up both herself and their daughter so they could make a day of it. She enjoyed shopping and walking around, and they returned to have lunch with the OP. As the manager, he indulged in some extended breaks. It was a typical Sunday until he stepped out to give her some money when suddenly his instincts kicked in. To his left, he noticed a man staring intently at his wife and daughter. When their eyes met, the man didn't look away. They had a big wedding with over 200 guests, and he asked his wife if she recognized the man. They both glanced up, but he had vanished in the blink of an eye. He says it couldn't have been more than 2 or 3 seconds since he last saw him. There was just something unsettling about the man that stuck with him, even to this day. He wore a dark gray suit with a matching overcoat. To avoid causing his wife any distress, he reassured her not to worry. They enjoyed their lunch and took the long walk back to his store. Along the way, they stopped by mall security where he introduced his wife to the security team he had gotten to know well. He pulled them aside to share what transpired and they expressed their concern. Next, they visited the information booth and he asked the attendant there to alert him if she spotted the man. His wife had always enjoyed shopping at the large chain department store near where he worked, so when she left for the store, he warned her about the man in the gray suit. She assured him she would keep a lookout. A little while later, the store phone rang and an employee informed him that it was for him. The employee then pulled him aside saying it was his wife on the line and she sounded terrified. He quickly grabbed the phone and she told him the man he described had been tailing her for over 30 minutes. She mentioned when she first saw him, he was reaching for their daughter. He called security immediately and they made their way through the center of the mall toward the store while his employees kept a vigilant watch on the entrance. He slipped out the back of his store into the parking garage, which was only about 50 feet away. The store had just 2 entrances, the front and the back, with plenty of emergency exits on the parking garage side. This meant the only entrance left unguarded was the front. Fortunately, a police officer had someone pulled over in the front of the parking lot. At this point, the OP was determined to ensure the man didn't escape. He wanted him apprehended. People began to gather around the store, and the strange, disturbing man had no escape route. Security found his wife surrounded by the store manager and several employees with their daughter safely behind the counter. The police officer had been notified, and mall security escorted his wife and daughter out to him. He and security quickly got his wife and daughter into their car, and she went straight to her mother's house. Meanwhile, the search for the man continued, with the officers scouring every corner of the store. He was never located. Even now, the OP can recall every detail vividly, but the one that lingers the most in his mind is the chilling darkness of the man's eyes, which were black as coal. In the comments, he was asked about security camera footage, and this is the twist I mentioned in the intro that points to these entities being supernatural. The OP replied, saying many people remembered spotting him wandering through the store, but the security footage revealed nothing, and no one could provide a clear description of this creepy man. The only consensus was that he was a tall, elegantly dressed man in a gray suit and an overcoat. Nobody saw his facial features or his eyes. The OP closes by saying that his impression, which still lingers to this day, is that his fashion was that of the late 1900s or early 20th century. His attire felt distinctly out of sync with the current era. There's just an added element of dread and apprehension when a story like this involves children, and I'm just glad that nothing happened to the OP's daughter. It's beyond scary to think that this man was reaching for her when his ex-wife first saw him. This story could have gone multiple terrible ways, but luckily for everyone involved, it didn't. That had to be terrifying to not only be stalked by someone, but have your child with you at the time, with her being what the disturbing man was focused on. The OP did a great job getting the store covered by security and his own employees, but unfortunately, the man disappeared without a trace. I've always said I believe these entities are supernatural beings, also evil on top of that, and for him to not show up on any security footage makes me believe it even more. There's no way that he was so skilled at moving around the store that he was not only able to escape without being seen, but also to avoid being detected by the cameras as well. What do you think about this one? What would you do if you were being followed by someone who had eyes as black as coal? The next story comes from a poster who shares his father's experience he had when he was a child. This story is interesting because it takes place back in the late 1960s. I like to include older black-eyed children's stories such as this one because they are thought to be a more recent phenomenon and even said to be made up. The main argument for them being fiction is that there are no stories before the late 1990s. But if you've listened to enough of my Black-Eyed Children episodes, you'll find some from the 80s and even farther back than that. The original poster's father grew up in southeast Texas right near the Louisiana border, where he lived in the bad part of town and was raised by a single mother along with 4 siblings. Their house was located behind a nightclub. Born in 1967, he vividly remembers an unsettling event from when he was just 2 years old. It has stuck with him to this day. He and his brother, who was about 6 at the time, were sleeping on the couch in their living room when they were awakened by a black-eyed child standing in the closet doorway. The child seemed slightly older, with deep black eyes and bright orange hair, glowing as if he were bathed in a spotlight. They attempted to scream, but no sound came out. Then, in an instant, the child was gone. The truth of this story was recently confirmed to the original poster and his father when they were at a family gathering. A couple of months before he posted his story, while visiting his grandmother, his mother, father, and him were watching a documentary on black-eyed children. His father shared his childhood encounter when his uncle became visibly emotional, asking the father if he saw it too. He also said that he thought he was going crazy and he couldn't believe his brother had experienced the same thing when they were children. The original poster says his uncle struggled with drug use and mental health issues for many years. For more than 5 decades, he believed what he experienced was merely a figment of his imagination, a trick of the mind. He says it's sad to think that his uncle's turmoil from his childhood led him to turning to drug use as a teenager, trying to escape the fear of possibly being deemed insane. The family was so frightened by the events that they chose to never discuss it again. The original poster's grandmother, who listened to their conversation, said that there was something in that house, and now he wants her to share her experiences while living there. It's sad to think that the uncle's encounter as a child led to so many troubles for him later in life. I talk about the trauma associated with cryptids all the time on this channel, but any experience with the paranormal or supernatural has to be traumatic. The beings that these people encounter aren't supposed to exist except in fairy tales and works of fiction. For them to see something that isn't supposed to be real can take a toll on anyone. And for him to think he couldn't tell anyone about this is very common. People don't want to be labeled as crazy or ridiculed for seeing something like this, so they try to bottle it up and bury it deep down. Unfortunately, that can really eat away at someone, and the original poster's uncle is one such person. What do you think about this story? Have you ever had a paranormal or supernatural encounter you're afraid to tell people about? I just want to take a brief intermission here to say that if you've had an encounter and you're afraid to tell people because you don't want to be called crazy, ridiculed, or anything else along those lines, email me. Your story can stay between the two of us if you want it to. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. People sometimes just need someone to lend them an ear so they can get their experience off their chest and unburden themselves. If that's you, email me. Alright. Now back to the stories. The next story comes from a poster who had a bizarre experience at his home when his girlfriend went out of town with their son. The story takes place in New Mexico during the holidays in 2021. The original poster's girlfriend had left the country to visit family and taken their son with her, leaving him home alone with their cat and dog. The entire day the events of this story take place was marked by a series of bizarre happenings. For instance, as he made his way to the bathroom, he strolled past the front door and noticed it swinging open on its own. He quickly closed it and pondered the odd timing. To ensure that it was secure, he pushed against it without using the handle to see if it would open without someone turning it, and it held firm. Content with that, he proceeded to the bathroom. However, when walking back by, the front door was once again ajar. The door had opened by itself again, and this time the dog was barking furiously at it. He tried to calm the dog down, which usually worked, but not this time. After a few minutes of relentless barking, the dog finally settled down. Fast forward 2 hours, now around 6:30 or 7 p.m., and the situation repeated itself. He walked past the door, closed it, tested it again, went to the bathroom, and upon return, it was open yet again. The dog was also again barking at it. 2 more hours passed, it's now around 9 p.m., and he was tucked in bed when the dog started barking. He immediately goes to the front door, relieved to find it shut. This pattern continued every couple of hours until about 4 in the morning, when he was jolted awake by barking and 3 loud knocks on the front door. His heart pounding, he peered out the window beside the door to see who was there. Standing outside was a boy around 10 years old, wearing a jacket with a hood. At first glance he seemed ordinary, but as he searched for the boy's eyes beneath the hood in the dark of the night, he saw that they were completely black, with no white whatsoever. His conversation with the boy started with him asking the boy through the glass what's up. The boy told him he was cold and asked if he could come inside, to which the original poster asked him where his parents were. The boy simply stood there in silence and had what is described as an eerie fake smile on his face while just nodding. The original poster once again asked about his parents, remarked about what time it was, and asked if he was okay. He then once again asked the boy where his parents were. The boy just shrugged. He then told the boy he couldn't let him in because he had COVID, despite him not having contracted the virus yet. Despite dismissing it as a potential home invasion, he hurried to the bedroom, grabbed his cell phone, and dialed 911. As he returned to the front door, he provided the dispatcher with his name and address while describing the boy, a process that took only about 15 seconds. Upon returning to the front door, the boy had vanished. He flung the door open and ran out into the street, but the boy was nowhere to be found, which seemed improbable as he lived at the end of a cul-de-sac. After his bizarre encounter, he went around the neighborhood seeking out neighbors with security cameras to see if they had captured anything on video. Only 2 homes on his street had cameras and neither had recorded anything. His neighbor across the street, who did have a camera but didn't catch anything, mentioned seeing a kid wandering the neighborhood a few days later in the early morning hours. But by the time she had reached the spot where she saw him, he had disappeared. When I first started reading this story, I thought it was a paranormal encounter. Well, actually, I guess black-eyed children are paranormal, but I mean a haunting. But then the appearance of the boy and him being described in a very similar manner to all the children in these encounters put that to rest. Actually, it's possible it could have been both, being that paranormal activity seems to draw in other things such as cryptids, black-eyed children, and other types of beings. For whatever reason, they all seem to be interconnected, and I can't count the number of stories I've read, heard, and done on this channel where there is a property that has more than one type of activity going on. But anyway, in this story, we have a black-eyed child typically dressed in a conversation that is eerily similar to what I hear in a lot of these stories. The boy who showed up in the very early morning hours asking to come inside. These entities need our permission to enter our lives, and asking to come into our homes or get into our cars, like in some stories, is their way of procuring consent to do just that. I'm just glad the man in this story didn't fall for the routine and was on guard from the outset of his encounter with the boy. Then there is the boy seemingly disappearing into thin air like so many other similar encounters. And if that wasn't creepy enough, there was no sign of him on any security cameras in the neighborhood, and one of his neighbors even saw him again in the early morning hours, only for him to disappear into thin air a second time. I mentioned in the first story that I believe these beings are supernatural, and them disappearing seemingly into thin air only adds to that belief for me. What do you think about this one? What would you do if you had a child with black eyes knock on your door in the middle of the night? The final story of this episode comes to us from a poster who had not just one encounter with these beings, but 2. Her first encounter took place when she was a teenager, and the second one was more recent as an adult and was still ongoing at the time of her posting. Her first experience happened when she was just 14 or 15 years old. She used to go to work with her mother, and one evening they were driving home late. It was pitch black out and pouring rain. There was a bridge that her mother firmly believed was some sort of portal due to the bizarre things that happened there. As they were crossing the bridge, a farmer appeared out of nowhere, coming from the trees by the creek below, and they had to swerve to avoid hitting him. What struck them odd was his appearance. He wasn't dressed for the downpour at all, and actually looked like he was completely dry. He was a tall, scruffy-looking white man with messy brown hair, stubble, and worn-out clothes, yet nothing he wore was wet at all. The original poster locked eyes with him during their swerve, and a deep sense of fear and dread overcame her. His eyes were completely black. Her mother paused and suggested they turn back to see if he was okay or needed a lift, but the OP told her she would jump out of the car if she did. Her second encounter happened when visiting her father's stepmother and half-siblings, where she currently was when sharing her stories. Out of nowhere, there was a child there in the house. He was dressed in overalls, a rainbow shirt, and had blonde hair with bangs, but his eyes were completely black. The strange thing is the OP didn't feel any fear or anxiety around him, unlike in her previous encounter. Despite his presence in the home, nothing out of the ordinary happened. To her, he appears to be just another, what she calls a spirit child, and even told her his name, which is Jason. As I mentioned earlier this episode, I believe these beings are evil, and I wouldn't trust this boy even if he doesn't give off an evil presence and she doesn't feel threatened by him. Especially since he seems to just appear out of nowhere and has black eyes. I know he's just a boy, but I think these things choose to appear as children to get us to let our guard down and allow them to enter our homes when they ask to come inside. That being said, I don't think this is really a child, just appearing as one. I'm not sure how he got in the house in the first place, but I would definitely not trust him. What do you think about these encounters? And what would you do about the boy she sees if you were her? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.